Welcome to the Takeoff Podcast, the go-to construction podcast for construction professionals seeking inspiration, education, or motivation for the next steps in their career. Each Monday, you'll be joined by me, Mick Donaghy, Managing Director of Gedin Executive Recruitment and a respected name from the industry. A construction leader, a business owner, or someone in the thick of the action. The whole premise of this podcast is for you to get something from it. An idea, a connection, a mentor, whatever it is, I hope you get it. And I hope you enjoy the show. Without further ado, let's get into it. Guys, welcome back to another episode of the Takeoff Podcast. Today, I'm really excited to host another cost management roundtable. I'm joined by three esteemed guests from the quantity surveying sector throughout Australia and specifically New South Wales. Today, we're joined by Adrian Budiono, Associate Director of Genus Advisory, Daniel Butterick, National Lead of Cost Advisory for RPS, and Megan Smith, Associate Director of DCWC, Donald Cantwatts Cork. So today we're going to talk about the technical benefits and value that a quantity surveyor brings to construction projects throughout Australia. As you know from many of my podcasts previously and the previous roundtable, I'm really interested in bringing, quantity surveyors together and those within the construction sector together to understand more, to bring a bigger voice for the quantity surveying and cost management sector to Australia. So, guys, I'm just going to go around the room and ask you to do a quick introduction to yourself and what it is that you do, and then we'll get into the show. Dan, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, no problem. Hi, Mick. I'm Dan Butterick. I'm the National Service Line Lead for Cost Advisory at RPS. A bit about me. I've got over 20 years experience, of which 10 most recently in Australia. So I've been working in Australia for about 10 years now as a QS. Previously worked at a small practice for many years in the UK, and then went to Turner & Townsend, which I transferred over here as part of my career process, and then I'm now the national lead at RPS, of which we have a team of just under 10 nationally, working across a number of different projects from various different sectors, including renewable, health, residential, lots of different sectors. So it's a good time at the moment.
Excellent. Megan?
So Megan Smith, Associate Director at DCWC. We're a small QS boutique practice in Australia. We've got 160 people nationally. I've got 14 years experience as a QS, second generation QS as well, so it's in the blood. And I've worked across New Zealand, the UK, and Australia, having worked in Australia the last 4 years. I've previously worked for kind of some big firms and smaller firms. So, worked at some of the big firms like T&T, WT, Gardner and Theobald in the UK. So also kind of seeing things from, a small boutique practice view right up to the kind of the mega QS firms.
Awesome. Adrian?
Hi, Adrian Budiono. I'm Associate Director at Genus Advisory. I started my career as a contract admin and estimator in a small subcontractors doing metal wall cladding and metal roofing before I decided to join the consultancy. Started off with a small firm doing a lot of retail bank fit out, and then moved on to hospital, and then back doing retail supermarket, and now I'm doing a lot of education and health.
Great. Guys, some incredible experience, both, Australia and internationally, which I think gives us, far better and greater perspective as well. So one of the big topics over the last, 2 or 3 years has been, the risk in the market. There's been a lot of pain in the market that's faced from a contractor perspective, from a client perspective. We're even seeing recently within the last 2-3 weeks, big contractors in New South Wales have went into administration, had financial difficulty. There's a lot of risk in the market. So one of the questions I wanted to sort of start off with, Megan, if we start off with you, is How critical is a quantity surveyor in mitigating financial risk? That's something that I feel, maybe the industry doesn't quite understand the value of initially.
Yeah, so I think it's the case of there's also lots of types of financial risk. Are you worried about the liquidation of your, the liquidity, sorry, of your contractor? Are you worried about the project budget? What sort of kind of like risk mitigation have you got? As in, obviously, when you go in, there's different modes, but I'm going to go procurement. So obviously at the moment it is really topical. Lots of subcontractors particularly are really being impacted by some of these large contractors going under. And so it's the case of it tends to knock on to people that aren't going under, and it's like other projects. It's kind of like a spider web where one contractor actually takes down subcontractors that then takes down other contractors. So it's kind of like a ripple. So the issue is that I guess we need to be having conversations with contractors when we go out to site every month and saying, hey, how's things going? Having a chat with the subcontractors, getting a view down at that granular level of what the market's happening, on site. And then it's a case when it comes to more general, like mitigating financial risk, we're kind of looking at, variations, understanding your project and understanding what the scope is, giving the client advice early on and being proactive with the responses. Like you can mitigate costs far easier from the outset than you can by the time you're halfway through building something. So it's a case of, really good risk management up front, having conversations, de-risking what you can. And then when you get on site, it's really managing the contractor and subcontractors as much as you can. And look, part of the piece in Australia is, well, in New South Wales, is we get that subcontractor deed signed monthly for the contractor to be telling us that they are paying the subcontractors, on time. And it's the case of that being more critical than ever, of making sure that the person signing that deed is actually, the right person. So should everything fall apart, it's not some admin person, it's someone with some clout at that company saying, I can confirm we've been paying our subcontractors.
I've never heard of that before. Is that something that's quite, unanimous across the board, or is that something that's been brought in recently, or?
Different types of contracts require it. So a lot of the GC21 contracts, which is public sector, really require it. And then some private contracts add it on, some don't. But it's a case of, it is actually a great document that you can hold and you can say, well, I can confirm my contractor has signed a piece of paper. It's a senior director and they're saying that they've paid the 28 subcontractors currently on the project. It kind of provides some comfort that as of that date, that's a true statement of account.
What do you think about that, Adrian?
Well, see, I think Megan's touching base in regards to procurement of side of the risk mitigations. Like I like to see risk mitigation starts from visibility as well. Like you need to set up realistic expectations towards your client. That way, then it helps you see helps in terms of setting up the project budget, and it also helps in terms of deciding the procurement method, which suitable contractors to do the actual delivery of the project. Whether you're going to go with tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So all those risks are mitigated right from the beginning in terms of setting up the budget. By identifying all those risks, you're pretty much capturing all the costs associated with it. So you know that by the time you select the right contractors, you can be up during the procurement process. You can really be upfront and you can be transparent with contractors in terms of what's actually the risk that we identify. And there can also be potential conversations in terms of the aspect of risk sharing between the client and the contractors. And I think that really helps, because then when you are transparent and you are with the contractors, it also mitigates them from taking that risk when they made a mistake and makes them to go into liquidations or administrations and start losing money.
That's a good point.
Just, I suppose, jumping in there from my perspective, and the guys have kind of touched on a lot of it. There's a few things for me. First of all, and this is slightly off topic, but it's worth noting that from when we talk about QSing, there is contractor side QSing, and then there's the PQSing. And I think, if I'm being honest, like, you know, you speak to a lot of contractor side QSs and they probably feel a little bit hard done by, because when everyone talks about QSing, they talk about that kind of PQS role, right? But actually, you know, if a lot of my friends and people that I work with now have come from that contractor side background, who have lots of kind of understanding of how it works on the contractor world. And I think, look, if as a PQS, if you were looking back as to kind of, and if you didn't necessarily have that contractor side experience, not necessarily site-based experience, but contractor side experience, you don't necessarily know what they're kind of looking out for. So there's a little bit, I suppose, of a learning curve there, I think, with a lot of QSs. And also, just touching on one of the things I think which is missing from the market and the industry as a whole is that, you know, I, as an example, very rarely get asked to review somebody's procurement strategy, because that's dealt with by the PM side, let's say, or, you know, which I actually reviewed somebody's contract the other day because I said it's an ECI contract and I have lots of experience in ECI, and so send me the ECI contract, because I think I've got a lot of value to add into when you're signing up to an ECI contract, in terms of mitigating your risk. And I think that there's definitely a learning piece there from a QS perspective, and how that happens, I suppose, is another conversation. But I think that the market needs to kind of share that load a little bit more, and allow us to kind of be involved in those aspects in terms of contract. And I think you can mitigate contractors' risks. You know, a lot of it, we talk about sharing risk in contract, and that, you know, pain gain mechanisms, which helps to kind of mitigate some of the issues that you can come up with when a contractor signs up to a contract that they can't necessarily deliver. During those tender processes, looking at the margins, well, are we, you know, okay, they've got 3% margin, and what is that really? Are you really going to sign up to a contractor with a 3% margin? You know, where, like, it's having, I suppose, from my perspective, it's having that commercial acumen to say, well, if they've only got a 3% margin now, where are they going to be making up that cost from? Is it going to be? Are we going to be arguing till the cows come home around, you know, variations? Are they going to be really commercial in terms of their variations, and then because they need to be? So I think there's lots of different. You could go on about it for a while, but there's lots of different aspects which I think have issues or are reasons why contractors sometimes struggle within the market. And it's not necessarily them just putting in a low margin and looking to. It's also the client and the contractor, the arrangement that they go into as part of that process. And also earlier on in the piece, you know, less involvement from, I suppose, QSs in some shape or form about the procurement approach taken and why you're going down that procurement route.
I don't know if any of you ever watched the show Grand Designs, but it's like one of my favorite shows. And I was watching it last night, and there was an 82-year-old lady who just lost her husband the year before. And she lived in this house for 60 years, and she wanted to live in the same street, but effectively have a house that was more sort of accessible. So she joined a house onto her own house, and her budget at the beginning was £600,000. And she ended up spending 900,000, and she had no money. She's 82 years old. And I just kept thinking, I wonder whether the contractor who took the job on, whether they went in at such an aggressive price, but used that to make, you know, the obviously the 300 to make their, you know, in variations. And obviously you don't know, but by the end of the show, you seen this little old woman. She was no money left. Now she's in debt. Her son had to sell his house to try and, you know, pay for this thing. And, you know, I just felt like there was the moral compass didn't feel right with that, you know. So in that type of situation, you know, what could be done, or in not even maybe in just that situation, but in general as a quantity surveyor, if a QS is utilized, you know, at the beginning of a project, can stuff like that, you know, can you mitigate that risk? You know, obviously you're not always looking to make profitability, but what impact can a QS make, maybe being engaged early, Megan?
Well, so I totally agree. I think it's a case that I'm going to say that not every contractor is out to make as much money as they can, but when we present them with a project and they win that project, and whether that's by potentially underbidding, or potentially it turns out the documentation isn't right and it prolongates and it is just an unfortunate situation. It's the case, I don't think everyone's out to try and make the most money out of it, but I think it's the case that in Australia particularly, we're seeing projects moving through design milestones, which the milestones aren't set, so tend to vary between different design consultants. So the quality of what you're getting is varying at different milestones, and sometimes it feels like we're just rushing along to meet a program, but actually it's not in the best interest of the client or the project to be running at that pace, because actually it's not a great outcome. Where if we took a bit more time at the design milestones, the point is the QS is involved throughout the design, we get to the various design milestones, we complete an estimate that becomes a hold point. At that point, we work with the design team to work out what the cost is based on what we know what's designed. The client at that point then agrees, this is the design, this is the cost, are we moving forward to the next milestone? The issue that seems to be happening on numerous of my projects is the client's already pushed go before I finished my estimate on that milestone. And the issue is the design team is then running away to the next milestone before we can even confirm if we're on budget. So it's a misalignment in the QS milestones with the design milestones. And then it's the case that you get to the tender point. And again, it's really, you should have your pre-tender estimate completed before you go to tender, because it should, again, very critically at that point be, this is the design that you want to build, this is the price that the QS thinks, based on those documentation, go, no go. And the other thing is, often in the pre-tender estimate phase, when we're looking through the drawings, we're raising all these queries going, hey, actually that's not detailed, and these are supposed to be a 90% set. So we're going to have cost risk for the client if we don't get this resolved. So it's also supposed to be the pre-tender estimate is pulling out clarifications and changes that need to be occurring within the documentation to mitigate variations happening as part of the construction phase. So it's just the case that projects aren't being programmed to actually meet all of that in the right sequence, and we're just rushing ahead. And again, it's like, I appreciate for some clients, like let's say in a residential standpoint, they want the purchasers to have the keys as soon as possible because that puts the money back in their bank account. But in a lot of instances where it's not about, cash flow in that way, it's like taking that extra 6 to 8 weeks, through the life of a program, paying a bit more to your consultants actually gets you a far streamlined construction period, and actually is overall a more successful project.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. So, I mean, the stock line I always use is that cost is effectively a product of design in reality. And interestingly enough, and I always talk about this subject, but and I've actually done a previous podcast on it, but one of the things in Australia that they tend to do is that there's no real definition of design at different stages. Not in reality, there isn't. So some people, they'll have they'll have RFTs that say, well, this is what 50% looks like, and it's also based on percentages. Whereas what tends to happen a lot of the time is, exactly as Megan says, that you undertake what somebody might call a 50% cost plan, but actually the architecturals might be at 50%, if that's what you call them, 50%. The services are probably at 20%. The structural engineer might be at 30%. I don't like using percentages as kind of the terminology or the determination of what the level of design is, but that's what happens. So in reality, the client thinks he's getting a 50% cost plan when actually he's not. Like they're not getting a 50% cost plan, and because the design level is just not there. So therefore, how can you specifically state, well, yes, with the level of design that we're at, this is the number that it's going to be? I think there's a lot of ambiguity there, and almost room for error, room for issues to arise, and no wonder you're going to get yourself into problems when you don't really have a definition or a defined terminology to say, yes, this is the level of design that has been produced, and almost a tick box exercise where it's signed off. And as Megan says, the 100%, this is generally what happens. You get your design information and you've only got a week to do it, even though you probably need 3 weeks. You've only really got a week to do it because you're the last piece in the chain. And then whilst you're doing that cost plan, the design's carried on. So then we get to, but by the time we've done that cost plan, the design's moved anyway. That's one thing. And then the last point I'll mention is around change and change control. And one of the things is that because we're not necessarily engaged through the entirety life cycle of the project, and I mean that generally we are on a lot of projects will be engaged, at concept, to do a concept cost plan, to do a schematic design cost plan, to do a detailed design cost plan, and then wonder why we've gone up $1 million. And that might be fine with the client in terms of drawing down on design contingency or however they want to manage cost, but nobody actually really knows why. It's very little opportunity where you go, well, actually the building's increased by 50 square meters, and they've added in two additional bathrooms. Whereas my view should be that, you go from concept to schematic design. You don't really need to do another schematic design cost plan because you're being issued a variation of the drawing every time there's a revision of the drawing, sorry. You're being issued a revision of the drawing because the drawing has been revised. And that's kind of more of a UK practice in reality, because you are, significantly involved in the project, you might only be across 3 projects. And you're involved in every single drawing that gets issued. To understand the cost implications of those drawings. Whereas here you kind of get a block of information, then you get a block of information, and then you have to provide a cost plan. So how can you manage cost? How can you really manage cost and really understand it? An example on a project I work in the UK, granted it was a major project and I was on it full time. We used to get, it was a huge job. It would have been probably 500-600 million. And we used to literally review drawing to drawing. So if you had revision A and revision B was issued, or if you got to revision F and it hadn't been issued, it would be a real problem. Because how have we got from revision A to revision F? I want to know what the changes are from revision A to revision B, so that I can inform my client what the cost implications of change is. So I think that's another element which, from a client perspective, actually understanding, and not necessarily through the QS, but through the project team, including the project managers, who's managing change? How are we managing change? What's the process? Because if you go back to your example, Mick, there, that then if you kind of on a grand design, if you had a QS from the very outset undertaking those costs and involved through the entirety of the process, and managing change, would you have got from 600 to 900 that quickly, or would we have started at 800 because you've undertaken that approach and that process? So I think it's quite, it's getting that process right and making sure that it's managed properly. It can be a big part of it.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things as well, and we try to use this term politely, but kind of informed clients versus uninformed clients. And that's only in so much as from a construction sector background. Are you is your client from a construction sector and you can kind of have slightly different conversations, or are they from a different discipline and, you're building them an office or you're building them a residential property or whatever it is. And it is just the case when you're dealing with clients that don't come from the sector, it's the case of they have to rely on the experts, and it's like the experts really have to be giving the advice to clients. And exactly what Dan says is, like, I've worked in the UK, and a true difference is the way that design change is managed is it's not. It's kind of like we get to the next cycle, like Dan says, we pull up the drawings and it's like, who approved this? And the answer is no one. And the client only ends up approving at the milestone. And it feels like the way that the design is managed, it's so different. And that's why, the industry can be a lot less, not rigid, but unstructured. And it is the case that clients, again, that don't come from the sector aren't paying for the right advice and support that they need to get the best outcome from their project.
Yeah, I'd caveat it by saying, there are some good practitioners that do the right thing, but there is a large majority of projects that I work on and I've seen that have gone through these issues, and a lot of it is associated with that level of that that design control and how that kind of works through the process. So I think that that's one way in which a client can certainly protect themselves.
Adrian, have you got
I
any
think
thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think there is also lack of understanding in terms of design changes and design development, especially when we are dealing with a lot of like DNC contract. Like, because the project is moving in such a fast pace, we don't really get a chance to investigate, like, hang on a second, when people are telling us about, oh, no, it's just design development, but sometimes it's actually not really design development, it is a design change. So we don't really have the time to actually stop them and investigate the design and give an informed advice to the client that, hang on a second, there is a better efficient way of doing things in terms of the design itself. And I think it also comes back then when during the construction period when we are assessing variations. I think a lot of the younger generations as well, they just look at the tender drawings and the estimate drawings. And then when they're assessing variations, oh yeah, I didn't see it in the tender drawings, so therefore this is valid variations. And that goes with the same the other consultants as well, the other stakeholders. They just say like, well, it's not in the tender drawings, but it's technically just because it's not in the tender drawings doesn't necessarily mean that there is a design change or there is a variation.
The contractor haunted phrase of a competent contractor would allow for ...
So ideally, if you were to say, you were building your dream construction project with the perfect job, if you can maybe recount a job that worked really, really well for you in your career, at what point should a QS be engaged and how should they be utilized throughout the job? Megan, we'll put that on to you.
Well, we would be engaged from feasibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because absolutely the best chance for success is starting with the right budget, right? And that's involving us at the same time as the architect and the project manager, and really working with the client to understand what do they want from this project? Like, what's the outcome? I always go back to the triangle of cost, time, and quality, and it's really understanding like what's the key driver there, and then working with the design team and the project manager to come up with a budget that matches the brief the client's just set. And kind of then saying, okay, these are the parameters, and as we move through the phases, we need to keep coming back to this. So when we get to concept, okay, how does that realign back to the due diligence budget? And if there've been changes, like has the client driven that? So it's really like setting the right budget from the beginning, setting a brief, and then, I hate to say it, but holding the team to account with that brief, unless the client chooses to differ that. And if they choose to differ that, then they accept there may be a budget implication.
So can I ask a really silly question, right? Because obviously I'm not a construction person, but who decides to engage with a quantity surveyor? So if I am, a property developer and I want to build a new hotel, call me Mick Trump, okay? And I want to build a new hotel, and am I the person who says, right, I want to employ this QS, this PM firm, and this architect, or who actually comes up with that team?
There's different ways. So in Australia, the general rule is in private sector, you are engaged. Like the PM usually runs the design team or the project team, and the QS kind of falls into that group. In the UK, the QS is very much direct to the client in parallel with the PM. So it is a different hierarchical structure. And so I think the best thing is, yes, it comes from the client, but ultimately the PM and the architect should both be advocating that a QS is needed from the outset for the success of the project.
So maybe I'll push this on to you, Dan. So if they didn't decide to engage a QS at the beginning, is there a potential reason behind that? Would they be able to, make more money throughout the project process if a QS isn't engaged at the beginning? Because maybe they'll be engaged for longer, or why would they not engage a QS at the beginning?
My initial, well, there's a few things there, but my initial thing was they just don't understand. They don't understand what we do, would be my first thought. Because why wouldn't you? Like if you've got somebody, I'll give you an example. Like post contract, I'll save treble your fee post contract. So before we've even gone into undertaking like reviewing value and looking at orientation of the building, water floor ratios, all that type of stuff that designers will go through. If you just think about post-contract, once it goes on site, I'll save you my whole fee for the entire job 3 times over. So if you look at that value from there, but putting that to the side, my view would be the QS would be the first person I'd procure personally. And maybe I'm biased, but how do you undertake a project if you don't know if you can afford it? Particularly if you're a client that's not necessarily, let's call a mature client. If you're a mature client, it's slightly different. If you understand what your cost base is, like, a lot of resi builders, for example, a lot of them won't have QSs because they know what it costs to build. In lots of shapes and form, they kind of understand it. And particularly when they're a private developer, or they've got their own internal QSs that do that for them, so they won't go and externally engage. But if you can't afford the project, then how do you proceed? So you've got to have gone through. You would have appointed an architect. You'd have appointed a PM potentially. You might have appointed some engineers, and then they go and design something you can't afford. What's the point? Whereas actually from the early stage, you could kind of say, well, I want to build 250 residential apartments within that area. You would procure somebody that has that level of experience and can tell you, well, it's going to cost you, say, 600, 700, 750 a unit. And therefore, does that fit in with your feasibility? Does that work? Well, if you want to hit that 750 a unit, this is what it's got to look like. This is what this looks like at 750 a unit. Before the architect's gone away and designed something for you and shown you something, which you get all excited about. Well, let's talk about what that needs to include. What size of unit does that need to be? What does the water floor ratio need to be? And then we can then say to the architect, these are your parameters. So the architects come on board, come and meet with us and the client. Let's sit down and say, right, the budget is this. This is what this is based on, right? Your parameters are this. Don't get excited and put glazing all over the place, etc. Because these are the parameters you've got to work with. And then they can go away and their initial design and their initial feasibility is actually designed to that. And then you're starting on the right foot. Whereas what tends to happen is the architect gets appointed, the PM gets appointed, everybody gets appointed. They then go away and start designing. They get to concept or feasibility, say, and before you know it, you've got a concept that you probably can't afford in the first instance. And then you're going back and having to, with abortive work, and having to kind of rejig that, etc.
And then hundreds of thousands sometimes. Like I've had that recently with a client. They've come to us at the end of concept and for whatever reason and said, hey, we need to know what this is going to cost. It's 3 times the budget. They've spent $280,000 already. They're now going to have to pay the architect a variation to go and redesign down to what, the budget is. And it's the case of, that 280 is lost really for a scheme that's not feasible. And, to any average person, if I think construction, we lose some sensitivity when it comes to money. But if you said to an everyday person on the street, I've spent $280,000 and I actually basically have nothing, you'd be pretty upset. So it is a case that, it's kind of involving the QS up front. It's like you probably could have saved 250 of that 280.
Yeah, I think it's going back to the misconceptions about a QS. That's why sometimes we just get engaged directly in the concept design. After the concept design is finished, there you go and measure. Because all the conception is that we just good for measurement. We just a rubber stamping exercise, really, like ticked off. Okay, well, there you go. But we actually, as what Dan was saying, we can actually investigate the design right from the beginning. We can analyze the percentage of UCA against FICA and set the parameter right from the beginning.
I think on top of that point as well, you get what you pay for. And so the market over here is really tough right now. And there are some people being incredibly competitive with fees. But the reality is when it comes to QS, the fees, we all have a similar cost base when it comes to salaries and rents, etc. What you really, when you're seeing a compressed fee compared to competitors, what you're really seeing is compressed hours. And so you might get the answer, like you might get your cost estimate, but that answer might not be the solution that you need. And that's the difference between paying what I hate to say bottom dollar versus, what's a reasonable amount is the level of input and support that your QS is going to give you, which a lot of us have. We don't just want to spit out a number and say, cool, that job you the project you've got, that's $50 million. Good luck with that. It's really like, hey, it's $50 million. Are these the right metrics for you? Is that the right budget? Are we, going the right pathway? But it's really, if we're getting bottom dollar, then you're going to have to do a lot more bottom dollars to make the same kind of cost. And so it's really like, that's a kind of key thing that I'm talking about with clients at the moment of if you're looking for the cheapest fee, it's probably not us because we're going to have to compromise service, which we just don't want to do. We want to be your partners. We want to give quality service. And so we just don't want to compromise on that.
Adrian, you mentioned there about, the misconception, the not understanding what a QS does. So for me, that maybe is a branding issue, a storytelling issue, an issue that we, the QS role, we aren't clear enough to, presenting in clarity what a QS can do. So do you feel that it's a branding issue in some capacity?
I do, in all honesty, for the past few years doing consultancy, what I've felt with a lot of the QSs in the market, it's also they're not doing consultancy, they're just pretty much doing what's being told by the client. So if the client says, make it happen within 20 million, you just tweak your numbers and produce the cost that's 20 million. It's not about being an advocate of telling them, hey, we can't build this by 20 million. These are the risks. If you want to do 20 million, this is the things that you need to do, like design changes. Tell them exactly, try to identify what's the one and what's the need. I think that's the misconception. I think that's what the misconceptions comes from. That's why they always just think that we're good for measurement and we're good for progress stamping costs when it comes to variation.
Yeah, I think you're right, Adrian. I think there's two things there. One, I don't necessarily think it's a branding thing. I mean, I think the IQS and the RICS, I think there's a bit, not necessarily a clash there. That's probably wrong. But obviously, there's the RICS and the IQS, and I think do clients stipulate that you need to be AIQS or RICS? No, they don't. That's a fact. And whereas, it's going back to the UK, yes, there's a lot of instances where they do. There's also more emphasis on businesses within the UK that actually give you a pay rise if you get your RICS because of the emphasis and the difficulty, particularly in the UK, to get your RICS. So there's that element. And then I think Adrian's kind of right in that he said, about the consultancy and actually what we do. I think part of the issue is that particularly because of the way, particularly the last 5 to 10 years and the training that a lot of the graduates and the team are getting, they're almost just getting that, do an estimate, pass it on. I need that by next week. Go. They're not actually really learning the early stages of what during a feasibility estimate. Well, how can I add value here? How can this doesn't look right. How do I drive value out of that? How am I looking at my water flow ratios? Is that efficient? They're not looking at that. And because we're very stretched, particularly the experienced people are getting more and more stretched because, targets are higher, profits are higher, everybody wants kind of more money. That ability to actually train the graduates and the youth coming through becomes harder. So it's almost defaulting to this role that is expected of us. And PMs, their mindset is for example, contract administration, that's all PMs. Whereas, I'm used to doing contract administration, procurement, tendering, writing preliminaries documents. I'll give you a key example. When we do our cost plans, 90% of the industry, if you talk about prelims, we'll put a percentage to it, right? Well, what's in your prelims? If you actually, there's a prelims document that actually should be provided. So, Megan mentioned about pre-tender estimate. I can do a pre-tender estimate if you haven't seen the actual tender documents that are going out to the market for prelims, because how can you price prelims if you don't know whether there's going to be one crane, whether it's all going to be done via mobile cranes, or are we just making the assumption that it's going to be done by mobile cranes and the like, which is generally the case, right? We're just putting in a percentage based on benchmark, which is, what value are we adding there to a client?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there is definitely a branding piece, but I think I think as an industry, one, and Megan alluded to it in terms of fees, right? Everybody falls over each other to get to win a job and provide the fees, and then they have to put the junior people on that in order to make a profit, and therefore that's the value that we provide to our PMs and to clients. So that's what they expect of us. And what you find is that the repeat business, etc., comes from actually when you do a good job and you actually go that extra mile. What's considered an extra mile, you're not actually getting paid for it because you can't put that fee in, otherwise you'll never win a job, right? You go that extra mile and you demonstrate the quality that you can actually provide. You get a lot of repeat business because they're like, oh well, and actually when you start getting those relationships, then they'll pay you for it, because they'll pay you for the quality levels. But so I think that there's a number of different areas there. I think branding is one for sure, but it's also on us as an industry, I think, as QSs and the leaders, including myself, to actually push back a little bit and say, no, actually, we've all gone to university for many years. We've all done our qualifications for many years. Most of us spent 5-6 years in doing our qualifications, and you're going to pay for it. Yeah. Whereas, and that's part of the issue. You'll pay for it, but we can demonstrate the value as to actually you're not paying for it. And I think that's the message. That's the branding, that you're not actually paying for our service. We'll save you our service plus and more.
And I think what Dan's saying as well is right. And it's like, I had a meeting with a client this morning about an estimate. The majority of the meeting wasn't about the estimate. It was about the methodology of the project and how that was impacting the cost, and did they want to go staged, and where were there going to be diversions, and how are they going to install this, and it was trying to give like context to all of these things. Yes, they have cost implication 100%, but it was also like a massive list of things that the client could go back and be like, I really need to talk to my design team, and I really need to think about how I'm going to deliver this, because as much as I've got a concept and now I've got an estimate that makes assumptions about what that looks like, the actual sometimes value that you bring is really saying, like, not putting your contractor's hat on, but saying, well, if I was a contractor and I was pricing this, I would be thinking about all of these things. And have you thought about them? It's like, I would say 70% of this estimate review meeting wasn't anything to do with cost. It was very much like, how do we do this? And that's really, a case where you go, we add massive value. Quite often, I think at the design milestones, we're actually the people reviewing the documents in the most detail, right? So us providing feedback and commentary is so key. And again, like Dan says, it's a case that it just isn't viewed as something that they want to pay for, which can be, tough, because technically coming back and saying, hey, I've reviewed your documents, I've got some questions on X, Y, Z, has potentially no bearing on your estimate, but actually is in the benefit of the project.
So when I originally moved to New Zealand from Ireland to New Zealand, I was recruiting across Ireland and the UK, and then effectively, I actually thought recruiting in New Zealand was a lot easier, because a lot of people were moving all the time, and jobs I was recruiting for were in the UK. But recruiting in New Zealand at the time, there was a lot of work, and it was a busy market. But there was a lot of similarities between the structure of what a quantity surveyor was offering in the New Zealand market compared to, as well as the UK market, a lot of synergy there. And then I moved to Australia, and it was just completely different, and you see, New Zealand and Australia, in terms of where they're situated from a geographical point of view, very similar. Obviously differences in terms of building methodology, but there's similar contractors. You'll see like an Icon in a New Zealand market as well as an Australian market. Multiplex have been there, Center Group. There's a lot of transfer of skills there, but it's very, very different in terms of, how the value perception of a quantity surveyor is considered in New Zealand compared to Australia. As someone who's worked in both markets, Megan, do you see any reason for that, or what are your thoughts around that?
There's a few reasons. So number one, in the kind of the scale, the UK is obviously where the construction industry was born. The chartered surveyor role of a quantity surveyor dates back hundreds of years. The RACS head office sits opposite Parliament Square in Westminster Abbey and is very, prolific in its kind of instance. And then you come to Australia, where we don't really even do QS degrees over here, right? So it's like, it's pretty hard to get much polar opposite. New Zealand, on the scale of that, sits more towards the UK than Australia. Part of that is because in New Zealand's construction law, you actually, for any commercial project, have to have a quantity surveyor review your progress claim. So they have made it by law, in effect, to ensure impartiality to both parties, a QS has to come in to do some form of payment recommendation between the contractor and the client. So that's, a QS role. You may still have a superintendent like we do in Australia, which is traditionally over there quite often a project manager as well, but you have to have a QS by kind of law. So it's kind of like we've been written in that sense. The other piece is the contract law support, like structure, mainframe aligns a lot more with the UK. So like JCT, NEC style contracts, New Zealand has a really good standard form of contract. They did some major overhauls. I'm going to say the 3910 was like 2015, and then they've done subsequent updates and also been like completing iterations. That 3910 contract compares to JCT, where it's actually pretty impartial. You can pick it up pretty quickly, fill out a few pages, and have what's deemed a fairly reasonable contract between two parties. That just isn't possible in Australia. The majority of contracts have to be amended or, if not, bespoke. And so it's kind of like the legal industry actually makes a significant amount of money through that protocol, and it's not in their interest to standardize construction contracts. And so unfortunately, that is like one method where it makes it really difficult between New Zealand and the UK, where it's quite standardized. And it's just, again, like Dan said about the design milestone piece too, New Zealand falls a little bit more into the RABA, so the Royal Institute of British Architects guidelines, than Australia does. Where Australia, again, very much flexible on what a design milestone is. So it's just a case of like, even though in theory, Australia and New Zealand, traditionally similar markets, when it comes to construction and the kind of the baseline, New Zealand's actually quite far ahead when it comes to the legal piece and the standardization piece. Australia just hasn't followed like in line with it. And it is a real shame to see. And it's been a challenge working across all of those three markets, kind of learning how each one differs, and then how you try and take what you've learned elsewhere and bring that to these markets.
Yeah, I'll give you I'll just jump in very quickly. So similar sort of scenario, I'm on a job at the moment where I had a conversation with a client today, and they said they don't think they need us to do progress claims because they've got the project manager doing their superintendent role and doing their assessment, right? And if you look at that, that's okay, fair enough. They don't have to over here, like as Megan says, like that it's a prerequisite elsewhere that you have to have that. But the whole point of this goes back to my RICS conversation is that in the UK, part of your ethical, you have to have an ethical standard. So there is a massive emphasis on ethical standard. Therefore, my ethical standards, I have to act with independence, regardless, right? So if I think that my client is wrong, I ethically have to tell them. If I think the contractor's in the right here, I ethically have to tell them. So if you go back to that scenario where I've been told not to do progress claims, because there's no like definition in terms of yes, you have to do that. They can basically say, we don't want you to do it, but then nobody's got any real comfort that anybody's acting with any, like the contractors have no real comfort that actually the superintendent is acting, fair and reasonably for them as well as for the client, because me as an RICS QS would have to act ethically. And that's not to say that, the RICS over here and the AIQS all have those ethical values, but unless it's kind of mandated that has to happen again, then those ethical standards don't need to happen, and therefore there's no assurance. You see what I mean? So there's definitely work to be done.
Sorry,
a superintendent isn't a cost expert, and traditionally, and look, again, going back to Dan's earlier point, everyone's different. So not to say that everyone does this, but some of the project managers don't really have a true understanding. They understand the trade summary, but they're not looking at the detail below that. And so the issue is, if you don't understand, let's call it hydraulics, you don't understand how the various sanitary fixtures and pipework and drainage and all of that applies within that trade, how are you going to be able to assess on site the value that's reasonably due for payment? If you're not the expert? And, again, some of these projects that we're talking about can be tens of millions of dollars. And it's like you've got, to not have an independent person who is an expert in cost saying, yeah, I think it's reasonable, you're going to pay that person $5 million this month, just to me is phenomenal when the cost of that, progress claim, again, comparatively very small. And it's just, again, it actually does come back to mitigating financial risks. It's in this market, you're never guaranteed how solvent a contractor may be. It's like historically we've seen ProBuild go under years ago, and I don't think, some people weren't prepared for that, but it's a case of it's all fine until something major happens, and then you go, well, when you look into it, if you've overpaid them, you're going to have to join the queue of creditors, and you might get 30 cents on the dollar if you're lucky. So it's just the case of, I think people get lost at the moment, but when the market's tough, it's when payments actually are the most important to be watched, because prepaying someone could mean the difference between, the project being able to reach completion or not. And what I think a lot of people don't adequately do, and this was a big one with COVID as well, because a lot of contracts determined COVID wasn't entitled to any prolongation costs, is you had to take the prelims you had left and then reforecast it to when your actual completion date was, to make sure you had money to get them to the end. And so it's just a case of it's not necessarily just about how much you've paid to date, but it's, if this person went under, do I have enough money to employ another contractor to complete this job? And we've had a few projects where the answer has been no.
Adrian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, to Megan's point, actually, sometimes you have to look at it this way, right? There is a motivations for, not directly, but there is indirect motivations for project managers to be a little bit more lenient when it comes to assessing program planning, because they want to make sure that the builders follows the instructions and everything runs smoothly. But that's what's missing is a gatekeeper, which is subsequent to the surveyor. So we will be assessing it to make sure that there was no overpayment. We also will be the second person that says, hang on a second, we need to pull back on this particular payment because it's not accordance to the contract. So we're not just going to side and assessing progress payment, but we're also administering contract at the same time.
That's a good point.
Funny enough, it's my own apartment is about to go through a building rectifications, and the superintendent is the one that's going to be doing the progress plan. And the first thing I say is absolutely not. There has to be a decision set up, and there has to be someone I put my hand up to be the one that is also reviewing the progress payment. Because I think a lot of people just think that we can do it. We know, we live in the projects. We are on site. We know how fast the progress is, but they also do not know. Maybe they're also not looking at the cash flow, because sometimes when I do check a progress payment, I also look at the cash flow and I see, okay, are you then delayed? But sometimes they don't think of it that way.
Yeah, and value analysis can be quite interesting. And complicated with like a D&C project, because the prelims or the design costs always throw it out. But sometimes, you're going, okay, yeah, we agree that like the fit out component means that a lot of the cost is towards the end or whatnot. But you can actually see if you cash flow it, to the best of your intent, not using an S-curve, but actually taking the trades and kind of saying, based on program, we're expecting this to be the kind of view of cost per month. And then when you start to track it on site, it is actually a key metric that you can see they're behind cash flow. It's like you can actually see it, and you can kind of say, well, actually, they've been behind cash flow for 3 months, and they're still telling us we're only 2 weeks behind. And you're like, well, actually, my cash flow tells me we're probably more like 6 weeks behind. So it's, again, we're not program experts, but these metrics can kind of flag a different piece.
So, Dan, what do you think can be done to change the perception of quantity surveying within the industry? How do we get things moving in the right direction with regards to integrating quantity surveying more efficiently within construction?
I think it's going to be a difficult process. I think the leadership arms of some of the influential large businesses, your RLBs, the WTs, the TNTs of the world, need to be a big part of that in terms of driving an industry standard, not standard for themselves in terms of, washing up the market full of because they want to fees, but actually changing the profession for the good of it, in terms of the quality levels that are required, of what we should be providing, because I don't think that necessarily. I think as a whole, as a business, and including like every QS company, I don't think we're doing that. I don't think we're actually demonstrating our value through, because I think we're driving fees as low as we possibly can. So there's a fee piece, I think. So to cut a long story short, I think we need to be basically demonstrating our value through fee and kind of saying, well, actually, this is the standard. So if you look at, I know architects have been talking about that in terms of like standard rates and standard percentages for different size of fees and all that type of stuff, and simple, complexity, complex. And so they're looking at that piece, standardizing fees across the board. There's lots of arguments for and against, to be honest. So that's one thing. The RICS and the AIQS, that industry body and more government lobby around government projects having specific, you have to be RICS qualified, or you have to be AIQS qualified, or the leads have to be in that shape or form. There's ways around that, I would imagine, but I think things like that would definitely demonstrate, well, I have to have this person on the project. At the moment, my interpretation of it is that, if you look at the EDCs, obviously the EDCs have to be signed off by a QS, but that's about it, right? And even then, how scrutinized are those, to a level? So I think, a real kind of push with that would be good. Yeah, and I think it's just good behaviors and good and driving quality that can only. I think we've got to the QS role has been diluted from what I can see. It's diluted by other consultants, saying, well, we can do that. We can do contract administration. We can. Well, I think it's the argument for why we're demonstrating arguments with clients or discussions with clients as to why actually, if you've got somebody that's undertaken variation assessments, then surely you would have them reviewing validity, as an example. How can you do one without the other? You can't. Like, in my opinion, you can't look at validity of a variation without looking at the cost. You can't look at the cost of a variation unless it's valid. The amount of variations that I've looked at on a D&C contract where I've said I'm not looking at it. Why would I look at price when you've not checked validity? So there's lots of things. I think it's it's a really interesting conversation. And I think it'd be good to have that conversation with PMs, and see what their view is on the world, and architects, and the value and what their view on what we add. Because I think we have lots of discussions between us, between QSs, and plenty of drinks and beers around the table where we kind of, all sit and moan at each other about what could be better. But actually, that lobby to make it better, how far are we driving that?
If you had an after work event to go to drive business, to effectively go out and do some BD, are you wanting to go out there and engage with architects and project management firms, or what would you spend your time doing? Because what I'm thinking is, like, there's an element of a lot of this is a bit of an echo chamber. We need to collaborate. We need to get a lot of people, we need a lot more industry associates involved in these conversations, to start to actually make meaningful change. So who is it that's really important in this piece? Is it the architects and project management firms, or who is it? Megan, I'll put that one to you.
I mean, that's a complicated question. I mean, firstly, ultimately, it's clients. If you're going to start at a real source point, like, they're the ones that, ultimately benefit the most. I think it's definitely architects have some influence, but PMs really critically do. And it's difficult as well because I just don't know. I still think it's an education piece that some consultants just don't understand what it actually takes day in, day out. And I'm like, we need to like take a QS to work day or vice versa. So you actually get like a lived experience, because it's almost like Dan said earlier, if you've never worked for a contractor, you just don't understand that side of the market. And as a PQS, that can be really difficult. But it's the same with an architect where, you know, they hand some drawings over and then they don't see anything, and then magically an estimate pops out, and it's, you know, how much understanding of that process. But I think with project managers, like my goal is I try to work with PMs who are quite experienced and will take my procurement advice and will also advocate to the client that, you know, the fee should be in line with the advice that I can give. Rather than saying, you know, if you want that, again, cheapest or best price, then maybe that's, you know, we're not the right fit. But it's the case of recognizing, oh, you should consult me about procurement, and yeah, we should be looking at, you know, entitlement to variations, entitlement to extension of time claims. You know, we have a lot of input that we can give, rather than, but yeah, again, it just depends on the project manager that you've got.
Well, I'm actually seeing a lot more project management firms trying to employ, you know, QSs these days as well. So it's such a melting pot. But you know, I think, you know, in terms of, you know, the challenges create opportunity, and I think there's great opportunity in the market long term for quantity surveyors. You know, I can only see over the last, you know, 2, 3, 4 years, there's, in my opinion, things are starting to change slightly. You know, I think we're maybe starting to see more influential people getting to the top of some of these bigger firms, and they'll have a background. Maybe that's coming from, you know, an international perspective of the usage and of a quantity surveyor. So I'm hopeful. I think we've got to be hopeful. Or well, you know, it won't be a fun thing to do for the rest of our lives. But Adrian, sort of closing thoughts. You know, what are you maybe excited about the quantity surveying sector, about the construction sector at the moment? What's sort of giving you a bit of motivation and fire in the belly at the moment?
Honestly, besides delivering projects, what gives me satisfaction is when I go back home and I know that I've trained someone well and helped them with their career. The old knowledge that I've learned from my previous directors and ADs, I'd like to pass it back down to the younger generation. So the checks that I'm doing, I'd like them to be able to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And a repeat business is always great. It speaks volume of what you bring to the projects. It's not only shows there are more things that you can bring to the projects and the client. It shows not just, it speaks volume not just for the brand of the company that you work for, but it's also for yourself.
Dan, have you got any closing thoughts on what you're motivated, excited about within the industry?
I just, for me, yeah, I mean, I take great pleasure in seeing people come through. I think that we have a lot to offer, in terms of, you know, more to offer, far more to offer, which, you know, I'm on a group at the moment called the Australian Framework for Design Services, where we're trying to implement stages into similar to the RIBA Planner Works, which is a big passion of mine, and we're getting some really good traction with that, which I think will make a big change for our profession as a whole, to be honest with you, because I think that, you know, all of a sudden you've got those stages, you know, we can be held to account in terms of what a 50% cost plan looks like. Yeah, I mean, I think from a personal perspective, I've been getting involved in a lot more kind of renewable energy, and projects in that space, which I quite enjoy. It's different for me. So, you know, that's been really good, and also working on a large residential tower in the city at the moment, which is a really big project for us, and something that we're really proud of. So yeah, lots to look forward to.
Megan, closing thoughts?
I'm going to say relationships, and I've definitely been working on some projects lately, building some great relationships, and it's actually so nice to come to work, and feel like when you're having meetings with the project team, you're like, I actually enjoy talking to these people and like, thinking big picture and having these conversations and getting some real pleasure from that. And that's kind of a great part of it. I definitely would say like historically the last few years, trying to beat the drum about this a lot in the industry, and it does get to some fatigue levels. But it's also starting to feel like hopefully the construction industry is taking a little bit of a turn for the better over here. And, things pick back up and we kind of hit steam like we were before. So,
Well, guys, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy diaries to come along and brainstorm and talk all things quantity surveying and cost and commercials. I think there's a lot of opportunity in the market. As you mentioned, Daniel, from a diversification point of view, a lot of different types of projects coming on the market. I think quantity surveying can only get bigger and greater and more impactful in Australia. And so I'm very, very hopeful. And it's bringing more people together and having these conversations, I think, is important. And maybe next time I'll try and pick an architect and a project manager, and we'll all have it, and a quantity surveyor, and we can all get together. So if you've got any recommendations, I'd love to hear them. But thanks, guys, for taking the time.
Right. Thanks, guys. Catch you later. Thanks, Mick.
Thanks.
Take care.
Before you go today, guys, I'm just going to ask you to do one thing. Can you please go to Apple right now or Spotify right now and just give us those 5 stars? Hit that 5-star button. It makes such a difference you wouldn't believe. The whole idea of this show is to inspire, educate, and motivate our listeners. And we can only do that if we're getting the best guests. The best guests want to see data. They want to see information. They want to see how many listeners that we get. And so all of this stuff is really, really important. So if you can just literally go and do that today, if you enjoy the show, just go and hit that 5-star button. It makes such a difference. I hope you've enjoyed the show. We're going to continue to push this out there every Monday. So if you can, hit that 5-star button. And if you can't, even share it with a friend. Go on to WhatsApp, flick it on to your crew. Guys, thank you so much for listening. On to next week.